Hello and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. I'm Kermit Whitfield, a member of CMC's Board of Trustees and Senior Assistant Vice President of Communications at United Way of Central Ohio. It's great to see everyone today on this beautiful sunny day. Today, CMC is brought to us with the support from Hannah News Service and the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, each of whom have many friends and associates in the audience. Won't you please help me thank them? Today marks the end of the 2018 midterm election season. And I just want to pause so that everybody can take a long breath before I finish the end of this sentence. And the beginning of the 2020 election season. We trust that last night's election results provided some clarity, we'll see, and direction forward. We just don't know yet what that is. Happy, sad, or confused, we thankfully have an expert panel here today to help us digest what happened last night. Please welcome Democratic pundit Sandy Theis, Republican pundit Mark Weaver, journalist at the Ohio Statehouse correspondent for the Associated Press, Julie Carr Smyth, journalist at WBNS TV, 10 TV, Scott Light, and our host, Chief Content Director, News and Public Affairs at WOSU Public Media, Mike Thompson. Mike, the podium's yours.
Thanks, Kermit. Thanks to you all for coming. It's a beautiful sunny day. The sun came up today, no matter who you were rooting for yesterday. Life goes on, and it's wonderful to see you all here. You know, I have all my headlines here about the blue wave and the Senate being held solidly in the control of the Republicans and Ohio's bellwether status being in jeopardy, but that's no fun. My basic takeaway is, damn, we're boring here in Ohio. You know, we like our Buckeyes to run the ball. We like our Buckeyes to stop the run. If things are going well, we stick with who's in office. You know, Georgia has this dramatic election. Florida, Nevada, Montana, Ohio, same old, same old. But that's a thing of it's an illustration of where we are right now as a state and the mood of the voter. I think we saw that yesterday in the elections. I think the key to the race, Mike DeWine won the race when he switched his glasses to those hipster blue frames. Built-in advantage right there. So anyway, our panel, I'm going to ask them to give us our elevator speech as they're riding up the elevator at the Rhodes Tower, the Rife Office Building. You got 30 seconds. Somebody gets in. What happened yesterday? Scott Light, we'll talk with you. Start with you.
Think about Congress moving forward looking like this. More women than ever, at least 38 women of color, 2 Native American women, 2 Muslim women. Texas sends their first 2 Hispanic women to Congress. Massachusetts, Connecticut elect their first black women to Congress. Tennessee, first woman U.S. Senator. Arizona is going to do the same thing. Michigan had an all-women Democratic statewide ticket, all women on the ticket. South Dakota and Maine elect women governors for the first time. At least 9 women will now be serving as governors. I was raised by a single mom and an older sister. I've long known who the superior gender is. I've long known that, and for people who know my wife, that Jane, you know, that continues. My takeaway is 2018 wasn't the year of the woman, it was the year of women.
All right. Julie, your takeaway. 30 seconds.
Mike DeWine was comfort food. Mac and cheese to an exhausted Ohio electorate who knew his name. They appreciated his long service, and they were not jazzed or energized in the way they needed to be for the Democrat Richard Cordray, and that took the Democratic ticket down with it. We saw in the early results, the unofficial results, that the Husted and DeWine ticket was able to hold Cordray under 60% in the urban counties, and meanwhile, DeWine won close to well over 60% in the other 82 counties. So that's my takeaway.
Continuing on in alphabetical order, Sandy Theis, your elevator pitch.
I think Betty Sutton would have been a stronger general election candidate for many of the reasons that you just heard. And she's the rare Democrat. She had job creation credentials through Cash for Clunkers that helped save the domestic auto industry. When she was in Congress, she was the author of the amendment to the Affordable Care Act that put the pre-existing condition requirement in it. Healthcare was a huge issue. And I think she would have excited the electorate. And if you look at the fact that we both elected Donald Trump and Sherrod Brown, don't have a whole lot in common other than trade, Ohio wants a fighter. And the people who get elected in Ohio are the people who pound the table like Howard Metzenbaum used to do and Dick Celeste used to do, and they fight for Ohio. And even though Richard Cordray has impeccable consumer credentials and has a long history of fighting for people, that didn't come through in his campaign. He was pretty toned down, and that let the comfort food guy win.
And Mark?
2 points, one from the federal level, one at the state level. At the federal level, we're in a strange political time. Each party is defining itself around the personality of one person. Republicans have largely become the party of supporting Donald Trump, and Democrats have largely become the party opposing Donald Trump. In the short term, the Democrats are going to have to change that if they're going to get anywhere, and in the long term, that's going to be a problem for the Republicans moving down the road. Statewide, here in Ohio, we are no longer a swing state. We've become Indiana. We are a reliable red state. In Ohio, the Republicans have such an advantage in the infrastructure of the political that it's hard not to observe that Ohio Democrats have become the political equivalent of the Washington Generals, the team that the Harlem Globetrotter continues to beat every time they play. And so there's going to be a lot of soul searching in the Ohio Democratic Party, which I imagine will lead to a lot of backbiting and leadership challenges, because if they don't change the way things are going, it's going to be another decade or two of Republican control in the state.
Mark, I'll start with you. A popular vote went for Democrats in by a pretty solid margin. Was this election an endorsement or a repudiation of Donald Trump 2 years after his election?
Well, we would expect the House to go more Democrat in a midterm. So that was expected. If it hadn't happened, that would have been huge news. I said to one client the other night, it would be realignment if the Democrats did not do well in the House. It was not, however, a rebuke. A rebuke looks like 2010. I think the final vote count for Democrat gain in the House is going to be around 30-something. In 2010, Barack Obama was in the White House, and 63 Democrats were thrown at it. That's double what happened last night. That's a rebuke. In the words of Obama at the time, it was a shellacking. The House is supposed to go back and forth. The framers intended it to be that way. That's why the representatives are up every 2 years. From my side of the aisle, what we were looking at is the Senate. Increasing numbers in the Senate means judicial nominations will not have to wait around on Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins' permission to move forward. So I will expect to see, and you should not be surprised to see, several dozen more Trump judicial appointees who serve largely lifetime appointments. And so if you have to have House or Senate, I'd rather have the Senate with a Republican president.
I'd say this. Oh, I'm sorry.
Chime in there. I just feel that, at least for Ohio, it was really, it's yet to be determined whether this was a decision based on Donald Trump, because what we saw was that Mike DeWine tried to embrace both the John Kasich Republican and the Donald Trump Republican, and those are two different people. So it's a new definition to me of the Republican Big Tent. They're trying to be both for and against Donald Trump, and it's working. Maybe because, as Sandy mentions, maybe the Democrats didn't have an energized enough candidate, or a candidate that would bring out the base in some of these cities that they needed to get the votes.
Go ahead. I was going to say it's interesting on those House races. So of the 36 toss-ups that were really out there, I mean, really could go either way. Trump won 24 of them in 2016. So Democrats had to really overperform. Yes, they're of course they didn't get to 63 like in 2010, but I do think that if it ends up being a 30, 31, 32 seat pickup for Dems, they did overperform in some red districts for sure. I think a couple of other things. I had a couple of Republican strategists email me and ask this question. We know that Donald Trump can tear down somebody. Can he lift his candidates? And look where he went. I mean, he went to Florida. And Florida is probably trending a little pink-ish maybe now.
Yeah.
And he went to Montana to try to get Tester out of there. I mean, to the states where Trump went and went frequently, his ego is maybe a little bit bigger waking up on a day like today. So I think that's a question. And then two, Julie, you mentioned John Kasich. Do anti-Trump Republicans, have they been flushed out of the party? I mean, I think John Kasich wakes up today and he really doesn't have a home in Ohio. I really don't think so.
That's true.
Yeah.
Sandy, were you disappointed that the Democrats did not win more last night?
Yeah,
Beto O'Rourke
I
being
wasn't.
an
I wore
example.
my red blazer today to pay homage to the people who did win. I wore blue yesterday on TV, and I had my Rosie the Riveter lapel pin because she helped us fight fascism the first time, and I thought she would help us this time, but it didn't work out. But if you look at, the Republicans are really good at rigging the system and then complaining that our team is rigging the system. If you add up all the popular votes for the Democrats in Congress, they got 51% of the votes nationwide, and if you add up all the Republican votes, they got 47%. And if you do that for the legislative races in Ohio, you see the same trend. More votes were cast for Democrats, but because we reside in these badly gerrymandered districts and pack all the Democrats in one district, the maps do not reflect the state. We have new rules that will be in place after the next census, and I was somewhat hopeful. I entered yesterday thinking that Kathleen Clyde was going to be our new Secretary of State, and that Zach Space would be our new auditor, and Rich Cordray would be our new governor, and the Democrats would be in charge of the map making. That very important process is now solidly in Republican hands at a time when we are a purple state, a dark purple state. So I think the future for the Democrats is really bleak. It's going to be hard for them to find candidates to run. It's going to be hard for the indivisible groups and the other activists to maintain the activism. And we are officially the Mississippi of the North.
On election night, campaigns are always cautiously optimistic as they
Yeah.
watch the returns come in. After the returns come in, whether you win or whether you lose, you're always willing to work together and be bipartisan. Nancy Pelosi said that last night. She wants to be bipartisan as the next presumed Speaker of the House. What are the chances of a bipartisan Congress?
Well, I mean, it's funny. People, you talk to voters, and they'll say, I like it when the Democrats have some power and the Republicans have power. That's also known as divided government. And that's where things typically don't get done. And then when things don't get done, voters will say, I'm just so angry that things are not getting done. And so voters are of two minds. They want to see Republicans and Democrats share power. In modern day in America, Republicans and Democrats are largely unwilling to share power and are waiting out the next election to gather power and get everything they can while they're in power. And both parties have been to blame for this.
But there have been cases, not recent past, but in the past where the parties have come together on fixes to short-term fixes to Medicare and Social Security and tax bills, spending bills. We haven't seen that at all the past 10, 12 years.
And I think there's a case to be made for divided government because you can blame the other guy. And I think that's helpful. And I think we saw that like with John Kasich and Bill Clinton with the budget balancing endeavor. What we're going to see now is we're going to see a House that's going to finally give President Trump and his criminal friends and family and cabinet members the proper investigations that they need. And what we're seeing right now is the Republicans saying, well, don't overplay this, and Nancy Pelosi, and overstep your bounds. Look at the comments that we've heard from people like Les Wexner and Captain Sully Sullenberger and other Republicans saying Congress has abdicated its responsibility to provide the checks and balances. And they really have. And I think we're going to see that, and I think the Democrats are not going to overplay their hand. I think they're going to do it appropriately, and they're going to make people like Devin Nunes look like a stooge.
I still think, though, that Nancy Pelosi, if she ascends again to the speakership, that's Donald Trump's best. I mean, he dreams of that situation. If he can put her again on the ballot in 2 more years. So I think Dems are in a precarious state nationally because, I mean, their 3 top leaders, James Clyburn, Steny Hoyer, and Pelosi are all in their 70s. And there's this new diverse energy coming in. And so I in the year of the woman, I think it's also a little bit dangerous for the party if Nancy Pelosi gets the speakership again. I mean, I kind of think that of the three leaders, James Clyburn could almost be a salve for the country. I mean, he could, again, that would be a historical figure, the first black Speaker of the House. And I think Trump would have to really watch his Twitter feed with James Clyburn as Speaker of the House. I do.
Julie?
I would add, too, that this could be an argument for, if you look at Sherrod Brown having a victory in a state like this at the same time that Republicans swept most everything else, it could be an argument for a Tim Ryan as the Speaker and bringing in the energy of the labor movement that's still largely helping fund the Democratic Party. And they can't now say that that didn't work because it worked for Sherrod Brown in a what looks like a pretty red year. I can also see, I tentatively say this, I can almost see the president wanting to do some bipartisan work in Washington on some non-controversial things like infrastructure, and the Democrats certainly wanting to have a few victories under their belt after being out of power, and it could be that we see a little bit of that for a while. Maybe that's just wishful thinking from a tired journalist.
If you didn't read your Twitter feed today, I want to follow on Scott Light's point about Nancy Pelosi being Donald Trump's choice for Speaker. The president actually tweeted today that she's a good person who deserves to be Speaker, and maybe there might be a few Republican votes to help her get across the line. And that's only half joking, right? That's how the entire House votes for Speaker. They don't vote by caucus, they vote by the House. And so if she is shy 8 votes from the Tim Ryan types, there are 8 votes out there on the Republican side.
Everybody talks about Donald Trump's approval ratings, been staying in the high 30s to now low to mid 40s. Her unpopular numbers are 13 points lower.
Yeah, it's
than
remarkable. I used to think my staff would put her in these ads. I'm like, why are we talking about Nancy Pelosi? That's inside. And then I looked at the data. She's hated in nearly every congressional district by Republicans. She's disliked by independents, and then some Democrats like her, some don't. And so she is actually a nationally known figure.
I'm not a politician, but I would love to run against the Republican who votes for Nancy Pelosi for Speaker.
You'd have to get somebody who's in their last term or somebody who has such a strong following back home that they would get the joke. Right?
I can see the ads right now. Let's move to the governor's race. Julie Carr Smyth. Richard Cordray, I looked up the numbers. He got 150,000 more votes than John Kasich did in 2010. But, as you mentioned, it wasn't enough to overcome Mike DeWine, who got about 300,000 more votes or so, give or take, than John Kasich did 8 years ago.
Right, so we were looking at turnout yesterday. It was a huge deal. We had amazing turnout. As it turns out, in a couple months ago, maybe 6 weeks ago, the Republican National Committee was really bringing to us as journalists the strategy that they had and how good it was going to be, and how comprehensive. And my first question to them was, you don't have very far to go. This is a juggernaut of a party that's already known nationally for being amazing in its turnout and its grassroots. And they did what they're very good at doing. Democrats did better, way better than they usually do. It was not enough. I mean, we only saw Cordray get something like 66% of the vote in Cuyahoga County. In the smaller rural counties where DeWine was dominant, he was getting 72, 75%. There just was no comparison.
Is that the problem, Sandy, with the Democratic Party right now, in that we are so divided urban-rural? I mean, shouldn't Democrats be doing better than 25% in the rural areas?
I think they should because of the economic issues. And I think one of the shortcomings of the gubernatorial campaign, and keep in mind that the top of the ticket tends to bring up the bottom of the ticket, we didn't hear those economic arguments the way we could have and should have. When the Democrats have swept the Republicans out of office in the past, it's been in response to some cataclysmic scandal, usually of the Republican making, whether it was right to work in '58, which irritated a lot of people, or the coin scandal, or Kent State, or the Crofter scandal. The Democrats as a group ran on that and just beat the Republicans up every day and talked about how it affected your wallet. They had an opportunity to do that today because our charter schools are so corrupt that Ohio is made fun of at national charter school conferences. They call us the wild, wild west of charter schools. I think Steve Dettelbach did a good job of focusing on that, and so did Zach Space. But you didn't see that fight from Rich Cordray, and there were opportunities to explain to people what it meant to them. There was a website that was created, I'm not sure by who, kidsnotcorruption.com, and you could type in your address and you could see how much your local school had siphoned out of it to ECOT. And then you could compare at another website, the knowyourcharter.com, and you could see what the state report card gives to your school district versus what it gives to ECOT. And the vast majority of the kids who went to the ECOT and some of these other really bad charter schools, they left a traditional school that performed better. And people would say to me, it's too complicated. How can you explain that? I think that was a really big missed opportunity for the Democrats, and that's a problem all over the state, not
Scott,
just the urban schools, but the rural ones.
Scott, did Richard Cordray have the wrong strategy? He was the nerd we needed, according to Elizabeth Warren, who came in last week. He ran as Mr. Nice Guy. He wasn't as tough as perhaps some Democrats wanted. Was that the right strategy?
I give my friend and colleague here, Sandy, a lot of credit because she'll come on our weekly political show and she'll call it like it is. And you've talked before about Cordray had a connectivity problem. There's a difference. If you want to watch the difference in two men walk into a room, watch Sherrod Brown walk into a room and watch Rich Cordray walk into a room. Vastly different. And of course, they're both eminently qualified to hold public office, but just vastly different. The interesting I think another interesting thing that you were kind of getting to, Mike, is both campaigns were pulling their hair out the last couple of days. In fact, I got a text from a very connected Republican strategist. He said, call me. So I called him back and he said, DeWine's folks they're scared to death of the suburbs because they were wondering about how women were going to vote. And DeWine's internals the day before the election had Cordray up by 3 to 4 points. I mean, so the modeling on both sides and the research that was done for both campaigns, it was off.
Mike DeWine loaned his campaign $3 million in the final couple of weeks, which shows you he was a little nervous. Mm-hmm. Mark, you're a supporter of charter schools. Was that a vulnerability for Republicans that the Democrats didn't take advantage of?
Democrats really pushed this very hard. The notion that they didn't push it doesn't bear out when you look at the headlines. Well, I looked at the polling. It wasn't connecting with most voters. Aiming your message at the teachers' union hall is typically not a great way to connect with most Ohioans. Most Ohioans are concerned about health care. Most Ohioans are still concerned about the economy in a variety of ways, and they're concerned about education in broad strokes. But the ECOT scandal fell flat, notwithstanding the fact that there were some real problems with ECOT. I think the larger question of what this last exchange here is what Scott just said about polling. Is a lot of my friends are pollsters. I read polling all the time. Polling is at a crisis right now for two large reasons. One is the use of cell phones makes polling harder, and people are less likely to pick up, right? And the kind of person who picks up their cell phone to an unknown number is a different kind of person than somebody who doesn't, right? And that's what we call respondent error, right?
You mean my wife is different because she always picks up.
Seriously, yeah.
She talks to this Chinese guy for 5 minutes.
Yeah, got it. And then second is, pollsters call this demand characteristics. Some people have learned that there is an acceptable thing to say to a stranger about how you feel, particularly about Donald Trump, not just. But there's an acceptable thing to say to a stranger, and there's an acceptable thing to say to your friends and family. And as a result, it's harder to get what people really think, because in the privacy of focus group, you vote your conscience. And so those two factors have made polling less. It's still science. Don't get me wrong. Polling done right is science, but it's making it less accurate.
I was just going to chime in that we, at AP, we dropped, many of you may have read this, but we dropped our exit polling this year for the first time. After 2016, we realized that it wasn't working, and as Mike is suggesting, the modeling is wasn't sufficient. So we used something called VoteCast. We actually partnered with Fox News and some other partners and tried to do something new. And then what I learned just a few minutes after the poll closed, or before the poll closed last night, was we were not going to use any of it on the wire because it was very tentative. And in the end, it did sort of show what turned out to be, which was it was still fuzzy. And I think all of us up here are still a little fuzzy in figuring out what it all meant and what voters meant with who they chose yesterday. So it's a work in progress, and I think that it's really expensive and difficult to get a good sense for the electorate. And if you think about yourself, you might have some trouble answering these questions as well. People are, I think, torn. People are concerned, and there are a whole bunch of reasons why people vote the way they do. It's not so simple as to say it's for or against the president, it's for or against the ex-president, or immigrants, or fear. It has a lot to do with so many things and the direction we want our country to go in. We might have a imperfect candidate that just doesn't resonate with us, and that's the party we wanted to vote for, so we chose the other one.
And I don't know about you last night, Julie, but AP called Sherrod Brown very early, like within moments after the polls closed. And then that margin kept shrinking. It was down to less than 2% at one point. Now, there were still a lot of votes in Cleveland and Cincinnati and Franklin County still out there, so you knew he was going to maintain the lead, but I was like, I wonder if there are folks at AP who are a little nervous right now. But it worked out. It turned out.
He got the most of everybody.
Yeah.
I mean, and it was by 30,000, 2,286,000. And
Watching the Wadsworth vote.
Well, Mark, let me ask you about that. Because Sherrod Brown was, before the election, the polls had him up by double digits, sometimes 12, sometimes 15 points. Jim Renacci lost by 6, was not well-known statewide, congressman from Wadsworth, not well-known statewide, did not run a very aggressive campaign. He did not run a television ad from June until October. He loaned his campaign $4 million. We don't think he spent any of that money. The RGA came in the last couple of weeks with the mailers and the ads about Sherrod Brown's divorce. Are Republicans a little annoyed that Jim Renacci didn't put up a better fight in the possibility they could have at least made it closer, if not unseat Sherrod Brown?
I think there's some of that going on. Something you see in both parties, but it certainly was true. Jim Renacci, I was not his consultant, I don't know him, I only ever talked to him once, is when the candidate becomes the strategist, bad things happen. And Jim Renacci was his own strategist, and that's like being your own lawyer. You can't be your own lawyer. You need to have somebody else represent you. And so he was making a lot of decisions himself. He'll say, it's my money, I make my decisions. Great, well, it's your money, you make your decisions, you're going to lose. And so I think he had a chance to run a better campaign. Sherrod Brown, give Sherrod Brown credit. Sherrod Brown has set himself apart from most Democrats in Ohio and has worked harder than many of them. And by getting common ground with the president on trade, he allowed himself to slip a little bit to the right of his party, at least on an issue that, particularly in the Mahoning Valley, which plays very well in eastern Ohio. It's one of the reasons why you see him doing so well in those parts of the state and Cordray not doing quite as well.
Here are the numbers.
He's been there the whole time on
Yeah.
trade. I mean,
Sure.
he has.
Yeah.
No.
Here are the numbers from Northeast Ohio, the counties that Mark just referenced. Ashtabula County, Trump won it by 19 points 2 years ago. Sherrod Brown won it by 2 this year. Trump won Trumbull County 2 years ago. Brown won it easily this year. Portage County, Trump won it by 10 2 years ago. Brown won it by 6. And Mahoning County, which Hillary Clinton won by just 3 points last election, Brown wins it by a margin of 60-40 this time around.
I think what sums up that race was their preferred mode of transportation. Renacci's flying around in a private jet owned by a strip club owner, and Sherrod's showing up in a Jeep made in Toledo or a Chevy Cruze made in Lordstown, in a suit made in Cleveland, and telling you all those things. He's Mr. Ohio, and people really respected that and connected with that.
It was about 1:30 this morning, and I got home, but I still turned on the TV. I shouldn't have. So ABC News, they were going on, and so to Mike's point, or I think it was Kermit's point, to say that today the presidential race starts. So they were going around the horn with their guests on who the Democratic 2020 players are, and all the usual names were mentioned. And then so they come to Stephanie Cutter, an Obama campaign veteran, and she said, wait a minute. She said, there's another name that we have to talk about that a lot of people aren't talking about, and he's a shining star in the Midwest, and that's Sherrod Brown. And so I think his stock went way up. It would have gone even further if he had won by 8, 9, 10 points. But, he's the blue streak now in a red state, in a pinkish red state.
Julie, are those counties permanently blue now, the ones that I listed? Or can Trump win them back 2 years from now?
I think that they aren't permanently blue. We did see some of the crossover voters for Trump in Mahoning Valley stick with the Republicans this year. That had been such a traditionally blue-collar area. I do think that one of the interesting things about Sherrod's race is that people did think it was so safe. There's a sort of a working theory that had he been more under duress as a candidate, it would have really brought out that Ohio labor fury that we saw in Senate Bill 5, and the Democrats would have been energized with the idea that they might lose that seat, which they did not want to lose, and he's got a lot of friends who want that he's made. In some ways, very similarly to Mike DeWine, because these are two politicians who have been around for 40 years, and going to your opening comments, people wanted something that they were familiar with. They didn't want change. I think personally, I feel that they were worried, exhausted. They wanted something that was that they knew already, and that's how they pulled the lever a lot of the time.
There's another factor, Mike. It depends on what makes first of all, there's no doubt that the story from yesterday was that urban counties have become blue outposts in Ohio. No doubt about it.
Rural counties are red.
Absolutely. But it's what makes the county blue that makes the difference. And so if it's more college-educated white liberals that makes it blue, Trump will continue to do poorly there. But if it's working class, what we used to call blue-collar voters, Trump will do better. And trust me on this, some people will chuckle, Trump will poll better with black voters than other Republican presidential candidates have. Now, that still means he'll lose it largely, but he'll lose it by not much smaller, but by a different margin. And those smaller margins, shaving a little more on African Americans, shaving a little more on Hispanics, is why Trump could win a county like Mahoning County, which is right now a blue county.
Scott, real quick, we're going to take questions from our audience in about 5 minutes. So if you want to have a question for us, the microphone is right there in the back. I think you all know how it works. Scott, quickly on Congress, Danny O'Connor outspent Troy Balderson in Ohio's 12th district by at least 6-1. It's a heavily Republican district, and even that amount of money was not enough to push him over the edge to defeat Troy Balderson.
There were people watching CD12 last night as some sort of a harbinger, some sort of an indicator that if Danny O'Connor won last night, that maybe the blue wave was on. I think in a loss, sometimes there are no moral victories in losses, but Danny O'Connor proved to be a prodigious fundraiser. $7.3 million, I think, was his final tally. And he was a good candidate. He stuck to his message. And again, that's a district that Trump carried by what? It was close to 12 points, I think. I mean, that is a you talked about gerrymandered districts. That CD12 was designed by Republicans for Republicans. And John Kasich was right when he said a few months ago that a Democrat shouldn't even be close. So he put up a good fight. But I mean, most people were saying that they thought Balderson would pull it out in the end.
Any other thoughts on that?
Well, the money largely came because of the special. Danny O'Connor would have never raised that much money if he had not gone on the radar of Democrat funders around the country, because in August, when there wasn't much going on, the anti-Trump fervor needed a direction. And so after the Connor-Lamb race in Pennsylvania, that's where that direction went. And then it came to Ohio, and then once he became on their radar screen, I think he was one of the more favorable targets for Democrat donations. Had that just been a normal race for Pat Tiberi, if Tiberi had, instead of resigning, if he had just not run again, it would have been another run-of-the-mill congressional race.
I do think that in Ohio and nationally, I think there's a conversation to be had about what Mark was talking about demographics going forward. I mean, I think, and I think you kind of hit on this, I think Democrats nationally have a short-term problem. They have a messaging problem. I still don't know what Democrats are running for in terms of the economy. And I think they could possibly have a problem depending on who ascends to the speakership. So I think those are two short-term problems. But I think the Republicans have a long-term problem, and that is with minorities, with people of color, with young people. And I mean, I saw a figure the other day that a young Hispanic turns 18 in our country every 30 seconds. So the Pew Research Center puts that at about 600 young Hispanics every year. Not a monolithic voting bloc, but Democrats are in better position to get young Hispanics and, again, people of color, women obviously trending toward Dems. So I do think there are long-term some institutional challenges for the Republican Party moving forward.
You know what Paul Begala, the Democratic strategist, said, that the Titanic did not have a messaging problem, it had an iceberg problem. So anyway, go ahead, please.
I'm Mindy Wright, member of CMC Board of Trustees. I want to hark back to Scott's opening comments. For the first time ever, Ohio's General Assembly will include 34 women with the support of organizations like the Matriots PAC. Do you see party structures adjusting to run more women to better reflect the number of women in the state of Ohio?
I think you will, and I think it's really great that all those women in Franklin County ran. We now have a woman doctor, and we will have a woman doctor in the General Assembly, Beth Liston. So to actually have a legislator who understands how women's bodies work would be swell. When I was at the Plain Dealer, and I think Julie was there with me, one of our male reporters was covering a committee hearing that was not related, and he called me and he told me that while he was waiting for his bill to be heard, there was a bill that would outlaw making it a crime to breastfeed in public. And one of the Republican senators offered an amendment that would have made you not be able to sue an establishment for slip and fall if you fell in a puddle of milk, okay? And this male reporter called me and he said, "They think it's a faucet." Okay? And I said, write that story, write it short, write it kind of bitchy, find somebody to explain why the medical community thinks breastfeeding is really a good thing from a health point of view. So I think these women we have elected are going to make a big difference, and I think both parties will recognize that, and I think that's a good thing.
Mike DeWine was worried about women when this started. That's why you saw so many ads about his work on the rape kits. I think it was targeted. You saw suburban women, we assume, in those ads telling voters how Mike DeWine worked to solve the rape kit issue. Long term, or how worried are Republicans about the women's vote, especially, say, educated suburban women's vote?
I wrote an op-ed about this right after the Women's March. There really is no such thing as the women's vote. It's actually almost insulting to women to suggest that they all vote a certain way. When you start adding in younger women, older women, college-educated, white women, black women, now you can start making some coherent political observations. Having said that, we do know that college-educated suburban white women do not like this president very much. But you notice I had to add a bunch of adjectives to be able to make a coherent political observation. You can't just say women, not women. Here in Ohio, of course, the Republicans have a wonderful record. I came to Ohio. I moved here from Washington because the first woman attorney general asked me to move here and work for her as her deputy attorney general. She went on to become the first woman auditor of state. We have our first woman chief justice, the Republican Maureen O'Connor. Our first woman Speaker of the House, Joanne Davidson, who runs an institute where I teach on trying to bring up Republican women and get more Republican women in office. So in Ohio in particular, the Republican Party has a strong and vibrant effort to bring Republican women into positions of leadership, something I'm very proud of being involved with.
I just want to add to that, though, that I think that as the young generation comes up, that the women's vote will dovetail with the diversity vote in terms of just people wanting their representative government to look like them. The Republicans did have a woman problem this year because they had not one woman on their ticket, and nor one person of color, and that was why Mike DeWine picked that rape kit issue. It was masterful. It worked. But I think that, as Sandy started out by saying, it could have been, had the Democrats run a woman as the governor candidate, it could have hit on that harder. I mean, the Republicans were sending their wives around the state to campaign for them, which the Democratic Party saw as kind of condescending to women. So, I mean, I think there are certain ways in which women do think as a bloc, even though, as Mark says, you have to drill down a bit, as we do with all voters, to figure out exactly what's motivating them.
Well, think about, real quickly, I know we'll get to the questions, think about the one woman we haven't mentioned who lost last night, but Stacey Abrams is within 2 percentage points in the state of Georgia. That's remarkable. That's remarkable
woman.
Going up against the Secretary of State, the white Secretary of State in that state.
I forgot to give our disclaimer, the Columbus Metropolitan Club appreciates listener questions and audience questions. Just as Mindy did, keep your questions very short and no editorial statements. Go ahead.
Pam Conrad, disappointed Democrat. So I haven't heard anyone comment on the role of dark money in the statewide issues, in the statewide candidate campaigns in Ohio. I'm curious as to whether we know yet whether more of that dark money went to Republicans or to Democrats.
I haven't looked at it yet, but I do know it was a massive amount of money, and it is responsible, I would say, for a lot of the tone that we see. If you all, and many of you do, know both Rich Cordray and Mike DeWine, and you were surprised when you were watching the TV because these ads, these grainy, nasty ads, didn't really reflect a couple of people who, you know, in their daily lives are pretty. Well, they're
boring.
pretty diligent public servants, boring, whatever you want to call them, but you know, and that's the dark money coming in where people don't have to attach their name to it. And so it's responsible a lot for the tone, but I think it looked to me as if it was pretty even on both sides and maybe equaled itself or canceled the other out.
Because I'm congenitally nosy, I looked up the Republican Governors Association's funding sources, and they funded a lot of those nasty ads that Julie talked about that were anti-Cordray, and I'm stunned to find a lot of charter school money in there. K-12 as a for-profit operator that operates what's the new ECOD. It's the largest online school. Like ECOD, it's chronically failing. It's been dogged by attendance padding. And they gave two $100,000 contributions in the last 15 months or so, and some other smaller ones. The Ohio Virtual Academy is so bad that the NCAA, which is not known for high academic standards, has refused to accept their coursework for 4 years. And they're now the biggest online school in Ohio. So I'm planning in my voluminous spare time, now that the election's over, to take a look at that and, you know, maybe leak it to these guys and see what I find.
I know you don't make these decisions at Channel 10, Scott. We saw at the tail end of the campaign, networks refusing to run an ad. It was a Donald Trump ad that talked about immigration. Do you think that the Supreme Court has ruled speech, money is speech, these things are constitutional, the Citizens United decision is here to stay until it gets overturned, if it ever does. But do you think TV stations, what's the thinking, they might stop, not air an ad that they feel is overly egregious, and where is that line? I know it's a slippery slope. Do you think commercial broadcasters might be a little more selective in which ads they run?
Well, it's interesting what's happening with broadcasting, because you've got groups like Sinclair and others who are coming right out and saying we feel this way editorially or we feel that way. And so that's a whole separate afternoon of discussion here. But yeah, I mean, we certainly, it's certainly talked about. Those are decisions made way above my head. But I think that particular ad that you're talking about, pretty much a 360 response to that ad was that was a deplorable ad to put out there. So, but I don't think that one in terms of on air for us, because Trump released that wasn't on Twitter at first, I think?
It was on social media.
Yeah. But if that one had come to the broadcast side, there would have been big conversations about an ad like that.
Mark, you're a big free speech guy. What's your take on this?
I taught media law at Ohio State Law School for many years. I taught election law at Akron. The law is pretty clear. If it's a candidate ad, the stations cannot refuse to air it. And we saw an anti-Semitic candidate who's a Green Party member down in the Ohio 2nd District ran an anti-Semitic ad, and the station had to apologize, said, we don't like this ad, but we have to run it. So when it's a candidate ad, by law, they have to run it. This was a third-party ad where the stations don't have to. Let's remember, though, if it's a federal broadcast license, Congress has the ability to order stations to run ads without deciding what's good and what's bad. I would just suggest to you is if stations get in the habit of deciding what messages are approved and what ones are not, Congress would be likely to act to expand that rule from candidate ad only to committee ad only. And I would also suggest to you that for those of us who like to chuckle about the president's use of Twitter, one of the points I think he would make if we were talking to him is, if the certain outlets in the media will not allow me to get what I want to say out unfiltered, I will continue to use the one platform I found where I can. And that's one of the advantages of a social media era. There are lots of disadvantages, and we all know what they are. But the ability to go directly to people with your thoughts on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram has changed the way we act in the political environment of America.
Sir.
David Weaver from the Ohio Library, CMC member. A quick speculative question. The last person to beat Mike DeWine in a race was Sherrod Brown. Had Sherrod Brown run for governor, would we have seen a different result?
Yes.
They're both well-known brands. I mean, Mike DeWine and Sherrod Brown are probably the two most durable political brands in Ohio. And they're both really hard workers who Ohioans know and understand. So I would not leap to a yes. I think Richard Cordray is not made for politics. Richard Cordray is made for appellate advocacy. That's kind of where his skill set is. He's not a natural politician. Sherrod Brown is, but so is Mike DeWine, right? Mike DeWine did not get where he is on an Ivy League pedigree or something like that. Mike DeWine works hard, and people know who he is. So I think it'd be a fascinating race. But I wouldn't leap to the notion that necessarily Sherrod Brown would beat Mike DeWine. I think it would be Superman versus Batman.
Journalists are terrible. We're
I'd
terrible.
let them laugh at the joke. Superman versus Batman.
Math on the fly here, but at least Sherrod Brown had 99,000 more votes than Mike DeWine last.
Against a much weaker opponent.
Yeah.
Speaking of stronger opponents, would John Kasich have beaten Sherrod Brown if he ran for Senate instead of appearing on cable news shows and possibly running for president?
I don't think so, because a lot of Republicans don't like John Kasich, which is very strange. And I think that his party would have been divided and the Democrats would have been united.
I would agree.
All right.
Yep.
Sir.
Yes, my name is John McKnight, a registered Democrat, and I received a telephone call a few days before the election from a Democratic committee of some sort, encouraging me to get out and vote. And reminding me where my polling place was, and they directed me to a polling place that was far, far away from my regular polling place. So I suspect that to be an attempt at, voter tampering or voting fraud. You hear about that sort of thing on the presidential election years. Don't hear very much about it in the midterm elections. Is that a factor? Does that happen? I'm sure if it does, it happens on both sides, so I'm not, taking sides in that regard, but just curious, is that a factor? Does it go on more than just me? I'm sorry?
Did you save the phone number that it was called from?
I did not.
That's too bad.
I've thought I might be able to go back through my phone records and find it. But.
I mean, I've seen anecdotally on social media examples of that in a small level this cycle, but I'm sorry that happened to you. That's not good.
We got a call. I think we took 3 calls that were similar to what you described yesterday in the newsroom, at least when I was there, and kind of monitoring calls that were coming in. Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised if there were all kinds of attempts to do that. I mean, I would like to dig into that somewhat more now that it's a little quieter. And we also have a number of lawsuits that are still outstanding that have to do with the processing of ballots and the treatment of the vote. And so, that's all stuff that sort of sometimes doesn't get decided for 2 years or 4 years after an election, unfortunately, but it does go on.
Sam Gresham, one of our panelists on Columbus on the Record, he tells a great story. One of the first campaigns he worked on as a young advocate in Chicago, his candidate was down the list of like 7 or 8 people. When he got to the polling place, the pencils were attached to the booths with strings, and the string was not long enough to get down to the bottom name. That was Sam's first lesson in political tricks. Go ahead, sir.
Roger Blackwell. I was listening to radio on the way, WOSU of course, and one of the NPR commentators said that most of the Democrats who won were more moderate, and the ones who were more progressive part of the party were the ones who lost, mostly, not always. And so my question is two-part. A, is that a valid observation? Because I don't know. I don't have the interest or time to do the research on it. And B, if that is true, would that change the strategy of the Democratic Party in the future?
Cindy, the moderates lost here in Ohio. Democrats, anyway.
The moderates lost?
Moderate Democrats.
Yeah, they did. I mean, there's an argument inside the Democratic Party about that, and you saw after Hillary's defeat, people stepped forward and they said, maybe we should start embracing candidates that don't support abortion rights, and that caused a big stink. If you look historically, and I think that's one of the litmus test issues that divides the moderates from the more progressives, every time abortion rights have been threatened, like in 1989, after the Webster decision gave states more leeway to restrict abortions, pro-choice candidates got elected. Democrats elected governors in Texas, Ann Richards, in Florida, in Virginia. And I think that we are going to see this issue continue to be really, really important because the Republican Party is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Right to Life movement. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing the gender gap. It was mitigated this time, like Julie said, because Mike DeWine came out very early on with those really effective rape kit ads and distinguished himself as a guy who, respects women. And the Cordray campaign did not respond to those effectively.
Well, and they also
the broad brush on that, because I think you just have to look. What did Tip O'Neill say? Politics is local. You've got to look at each race. I mean, Connor Lamb in Pennsylvania's 18 could not win in Santa Barbara, California. So, and a Missouri Democrat is different from a Kentucky Democrat versus a Virginia Democrat. So I think you got to get granular on that question and look at each race and each candidate that comes to the fore.
And that's why you have liberal Republican governors in Massachusetts and Maryland, which are bright blue states, winning, because they are a different kind of Republican, because those are different kinds of states. That's one of the interesting things about American politics is there is really not a uniform position across either party, state by state. You'll see different variations.
Right, and we have Sherrod Brown here who they always try to run against him, and they label him as the most, or if not the most, one of the most liberal senators, and it never works. I mean, people, once they know a politician and they know their background and their work, I don't think the labels really stick in Ohio as much. They vote for the person.
All right, Kermit, we'll leave it to you.
All right, well, thank you, speakers. We'll definitely have to have you back before 2 years from now. Let's thank Hannah News Service and the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation for their support, and our speakers, Sandy Theis, Mark Weaver, Julie Carr Smyth, Scott Light, Mike Thompson. And thanks to all of you. We'll see you here next week.
Thank you.